Some of the likely actions the U.S. could take to retaliate for attacks like these?
Well, I mean, there's a whole range of things, anything from, a covert means like a cyber attack to an overt missile strike within Iran, which would be another big escalation in this whole situation.
Right.
So it's up to Trump.
Asha, what traditionally would be the U.S. response to an escalation like this? Because regardless of whether it's a big escalation or a small escalation, it is undoubtedly an escalation.
Looking at the commander-in-chief right now, it looks like his decision-making is pretty high risk. So I would say there's a higher probability. But then again, we have to take into account that the president doesn't necessarily want to go into another war. We're already in two. Why would you want to be in pursuit of another one? Mm-hmm. We have to end these endless wars. But again, this is a very high-risk commander-in-chief in terms of decision-making.
He has been saying that's been behind, withdrawing the troops from Syria, for instance. But then, this strike on Soleimani seems to suggest the reverse, because you would not make a strike on Iran's top general without imagining that there would be some sort of retaliation, no?
Yeah, and you got to also take into account in terms of, did he get kind of, hate the lack of term of using lucky, or didn't necessarily expect to actually hit General Soleimani. So, that's also the big argument there, too, because doing that, that's going to escalate into something bigger. So we will see, though.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I also want to bring in Behnam Bentaleb. He joins us on the phone now. Behnam is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Behnam, what has been this administration's posture toward Iran in the past, and how have we seen that shifting or evolving?
Well, great to be with you. The posture of Iran's proxies in the past, you mean? Or
what has been how U.S. strategy towards Iran, how has that been changing recently?
Well, U.S. strategy as of late December has evolved on Iran, because when Iran, after 6 months of escalation this summer, from May until December, had been incrementally ratcheting up the pressure against America, looking to get America to suspend, if not upend entirely, its sanction strategy against Iran. I remember those sanctions were restored because when Donald Trump left the nuclear deal, penalties, financial sanctions, and whatnot that were previously waived returned and were issued again. Those sanctions were effective in record time, and this whole summer, Iran had been looking for a way to break out of the box, hence the kidnapping of the tanker, the mining of parts of the Persian Gulf and Strait of Hormuz, the downing of the drone, and the escalation built and built and built, so much so that in December they killed an American. It's the first American that died, is part of this max pressure campaign, and the Trump administration seems to have a very high threshold for the use of force. Yeah. But when finally that blood was spilled, the Trump administration responded, and blood begot blood, metal begot metal, and the U.S. responded against an Iran-backed Shia militia for the first time simultaneously on the Iraqi and Syrian side of the border. That begot the response by pro-Iran militias and supporters of Iran inside Baghdad, who basically stormed the outer walls of the Iranian, of the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. Then, of course, the administration said it had the intelligence about this impending attack by Soleimani, and through a drone strike took out Iran's most seasoned military general in the past 40 years.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for that fabulous description and summary of, the past few significant months between the U.S. and Iran. I also want to talk for a moment about the fact that Iran was experiencing some pretty severe civil unrest before this attack on Soleimani, which I suppose was a direct result of the fact that the economy was being squeezed, correct? Or you obviously know better what was causing the protests. Has this given the country sort of a pass, as it were, to sort of refocus its citizens' energies?
It may be, but at the same time, of course, the Islamic Republic can't prosecute a war if it's bankrupt.
Right.
And the protests that we saw in mid-November, again, the spark was quite similar to the protests we saw in 2017 and 2018, where it's an economic grievance by the street against the state. But what sustained the protests in the face of pressure was political grievances. As long as there's been an Islamic Republic, there has been protests by the street against the state, against the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the more recent protests we've been seeing actually are responded to with much more lethal force from the state against the streets, and also they're happening much quicker. There used to be decades between significant protests. Now it's just a matter of months. So the Iranian people feel braver. They're going out into the streets more often than not, but they're being met with much more lethal force. So that is the predicate to this. And the regime is trying to use the Soleimani death as a rally around the flag moment. Time will tell if it works, but I don't think it will work. If this crisis we're seeing now with the missile strikes and Iran's responses does escalate further, and there is any kind of strike on Iranian territory, that could be one of the deciding factors to get the population to rally around the government. But anything short of that, I think there will remain a significant cleavage between the state, which is revolutionary, and the society, which is post-revolutionary.
Right. And I'm curious what long-term effect the death of Soleimani will have on that. Matthew, how popular was Soleimani among the sort of younger Iranian generation that appears to be craving more, civil freedoms?
Well, and it sounds like some of your guests may be more expert on Iranian domestic politics than me, so I'm happy to defer to them. But, I think Soleimani was more popular among some segments of the population than others, among the military regime, certainly seen as a key figure, but hated by other parts of Iran. There were many parts of Iranian society that didn't want to see the resources going to this overseas empire that he was building, trying to build in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen. So there are many in Iran, younger generation, as you point out, who are much more pro-Western in their orientation, would like to see, you can't say it publicly, but would like to see a different government in power that was more responsive to their needs, more respectful of human rights and basic freedom.
So, Behnam, tell us who is the backbone or who makes up the bulk of these protesters in Iran, and are those groups likely to be diehard Soleimani supporters, or are they groups for whom the death of Soleimani and the grief will pass more quickly?
You mean who would be a natural constituency for to be pro-Soleimani?
No, yes, exactly. In terms of the groups that were protesting and that were being fired upon by the Iranian government, those groups, how are they likely to feel about the death of Soleimani?
The more popular, more well-known protests in modern Iranian history, 1999, 2009, they were almost entirely centered in the capital in Tehran, largely among the middle class as well as the affluent, and then some a little bit more Iranians with a little bit more of a liberal disposition when it did spread elsewhere, as in 2009. 2017, 18, 19, those protests are actually from the periphery. You can call them blue-collar protesters. We like to say that those were the people that the revolution was really made for. They are the part of the downtrodden and dispossessed, the urban and rural poor classes, somewhat actually more religious classes. And unlike some of the more liberal-minded Iranians in the capital, these individuals on the periphery were chastising the regime using highly nationalist language, highly nationalist slogans. Basically, what your guest was saying about spending money on foreign wars is absolutely correct. They would mock the regime's foreign adventures. They would mock the fact that Iran is standing with Palestinian terror and rejectionist groups. And those kind of chants continued from 2017 up until present in 2019, I should say, because Iran continued to spend money more on those foreign adventures than on building the country up at home.
So that doesn't bode well for the Iranian government if you have groups among the more blue-collar, areas and the elitists who are also...
Which is why they responded with such lethal force and so quickly, and why they, under the most recent protest, the one that started November 15, 16, and went into December, why there was a sustained internet blackout. I'm sure you know the phrase, democracy dies in the darkness. It's this tagline of the Washington Post. Yeah. When you simply look at the lack of reporting that was able to get in and out of Iran because of the media blackout and because of the pulling the plug of the internet, it's clear that now the Iranian people are the ones who also died in the darkness. And there was a Reuters report recently that said there has been up to 1,500 killed in that protest, marking it the most deadly protest in the modern history of the Islamic Republic.
So has the Trump administration inadvertently handed the Iranian regime a sort of gift in disguise?
I don't think so. I think much depends on the U.S. response to this. The first thing I just have to say is I am shocked by the brazenness of this. The Islamic Republic may have been betting the Trump administration won't respond. That's why the Iranians usually proliferate weapons throughout the region. They don't tend to fire them from their own territory because that would be more of a dead giveaway. Moreover, this is not like the classic rocket or mortar attacks that you've read about countless times in 2018 and 2019. This is a ballistic missile barrage. This is a salvo. This is a act of warfare. There's a target in mind. It's part of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force. It's part of the formal missile command of the country. This had to really go up the chain, and it's also highly symbolic. But it's not just symbolic. So again, so much depends on the Trump administration's response to this. Again,
right.
If the response is on Iranian territory, on the physical soil, I think you could have a slow rally effect. And it depends, again, what targets the administration would have. If the response is against Iranian assets in places like Iraq, or, during the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. sunk about 2/3 of the Iranian conventional Navy, as well as parts of the IRGC Navy. That may be an option for something offshore, like an oil installation or an asset that is not on Iranian territory.
Right.
But again, much depends on the target and the way the administration will choose to respond.
So you consider both of these attacks to be stronger than you would have expected from the Iranian regime. And does that
qualitatively stronger?
And does that then reflect an element of desperation?
I think there's an element of desperation, but also perhaps an element of misreading. They have more data about Trump's passivity on Iran when it comes to military force than they do about Trump's activeness on Iran, meaning that they saw the U.S. absorb 6 months of retaliation from May to December. And the only time the U.S. used military force, of course, was in December against the contractor and when the U.S. shifted to do a preemptive strike with a drone against Qasem Soleimani. They may have been betting that that's all the U.S. could muster. I think it's highly likely that the U.S. is going to respond kinetically or with military force.
Yeah.
And that, too, is unclear if it's going to be able to put the Iranians out or to foster a further cycle of escalation. How much of this is signaling versus how much of this is basically warfighting aptitudes is going to be unfolding over the next few hours.
Well, it is clear that the Iranian strategy of these sort of petty and escalating aggressions against the U.S. has not been working for it.
I think it had been, but because the U.S. It had been, psychologically. The Iranians were trying to, over the past, 6 to 9 months, solidify the impression that basically was the opposite of Teddy Roosevelt. That Teddy Roosevelt maxim, speak softly and carry a big stick. This was the Iranians trying to say that Trump is speaking loudly and carrying no stick, that he will not enforce these red lines, that the U.S. is a paper tiger, that all they do is sanctions. These kind of arguments that you hear from them. And these are probably the arguments that existed in the halls of power in that country, especially among the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and especially among members of the Quds Force, the lower rank and file, whose commander of which was killed recently by this drone.
Right.
So they may have been singing the choruses of massive escalation.
All right. Now, joining me on the phone is Jeffrey McCausland. He's a CBS News Radio national security consultant and a retired U.S. Army colonel. Jeffrey, tell us, if you will, please put it into context for us, how significant these two attacks are.
This is a huge escalatory step by the Iranians. They have escalated, first of all, the use of weapons, the use of ballistic missiles as opposed to shorter-range weapons or mortars and the like. They've escalated in terms of geography. They've launched these weapons clearly from their soil against American targets in Iraq. Certainly they've escalated by making it a direct attack by Iranian forces, formal forces of the Iran against the United States. The Iranian Revolutionary Guards have already taken credit for these particular attacks. And last and certainly not least, once again, they're taking full credit for this, demonstrating not only to the world but to their own population that they're going to make this type of a military attack against a military target in response to the killing of Qasem Soleimani.
And you have been to the Al-Assad Air Base multiple times. What role does it play for military forces there?
Well, back in the early days when we had huge forces in the region, this was a major base in Anbar province where there was an enormous amount of fighting in places like Fallujah and Ramadi and places like that. So Al-Assad was a major base for U.S. aircraft operating in the region, both rotary wing, fixed wing, and drones. It also was a major resupply point for the movement of military hardware, equipment, and munitions to support U.S. forces. And after we returned in 2014, I haven't been there since we returned in 2014, my guess is it resumed that same kind of role, probably also providing logistical support not only for U.S. forces but also for Iraqi forces, and may have well been the site where we're also conducting a lot of training of Iraqi forces as we also continue our operations to drive out and destroy the residuals of ISIS still operating in Iraq.
Now, we are learning that President Trump and Vice President Pence have been briefed on these attacks. What can you tell us about what might be going on at the White House right now in the Trump administration? What sort of possible responses are being weighed?
Well, there's also reports that Secretary of State Pompeo and the SecDef Esper have also gone to the White House. And obviously the president, to some degree, painted himself into a corner by his rhetoric already, by vowing even in advance of this in the last couple of days that any attack on American forces in the region would be considered an attack by Iran and elicit a massive American response. Well, now that attack has occurred and the Iranians are taking clear credit for it, so it's hard for me to believe that the president can ignore that particular response. That being said, we now have been once again and continue to be on an escalatory spiral that has been going on for the last couple of weeks, beginning with the killing of that American contractor at a base in northern Iraq, subsequently followed by U.S. airstrikes, and then subsequently followed by that by the killing of Qasem Soleimani. The Iranians now have responded to the killing of Soleimani. So now we're into the third move in this immediate crisis. Does the administration want to continue to escalate and move the nation closer to outright overt war with Iran? Or does it want to seek some way to try to de-escalate this crisis and try to bring things back down and hopefully find some effort to move towards a diplomatic political solution? That's the question they're going to be asking each other.
And Jeffrey, it also seems like the president is going to have to sort of deal with two conflicting impulses, which is one, the last thing that he wants or anyone else wants at this point is another Iraq war, right? To see lots of troops being, heading to the Middle East to fight. At the same time, like you said, there is a rhetoric that has almost put him in a box and sort of made increased aggression inevitable. So how do you balance those two conflicting impulses?
Yeah, that's where the president's going to have to try to find a way to thread that needle. And don't forget, this is the guy who ran on a platform of reducing U.S. military presence in the region, which resonated very largely with his base, number one.
Right.
And number two, now we see that particular effort expanding. One could also say, however, cynically, at this particular moment, the president might also think that distracting American attention away from an impeachment trial that he's about to undergo in the next few days might be a reason to continue up the escalatory ladder. I certainly hope that is not true, but I'm sure some people will suggest that. But last but not least, many people argue that this is a crisis of the president's creation, beginning with the ending of the Iranian nuclear deal, which had put us in a position where at least their nuclear weapon program was constrained and hopefully would allow us to seek some kind of modus vivendi on other issues. And along the way now, that has moved from that to this maximum pressure campaign to the series of events you and I are discussing as we've moved slowly but steadily on an ever-increasing escalatory ladder with Iran.
Absolutely. All right, so I want to bring in now CBSN political contributor Zeke Miller, who is in Washington. He's a White House reporter for the Associated Press. Zeke, what is the latest you can tell us about what's going on in the White House right now?
We haven't received any new information from the White House since that initial statement from Stephanie Grisham, but we do know that senior administration officials, including the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, arrived in the last few minutes at the White House, presumably to continue monitoring the situation from here with the president. We have not heard directly from the president now since the 2+ hours now since that apparent ballistic missile attack. We've heard from the Pentagon, but not yet from the president.
And is there any new information about what damage has come out of both of these attacks? I know that we're waiting on that. Reportedly, the assessments are still taking place. Do you know when we're likely to hear more about those assessments?
We do not just yet know. Presumably that is a part of what is going on in ongoing communications. There's also waiting to see if that initial round of missile fire was it. Was there potentially more to come? So it's obviously still dark in that part of the world right now. And certainly by the time the sun rises, we will get a greater sense of what in fact happened overnight there and what's to come afterwards.
And Jeffrey, in terms of assessing the damage of these, Zeke, in terms of assessing the damage, how crucial is that information to determining next steps?
That will certainly be crucial for the U.S. I mean, obviously, the president has sort of said that and U.S. officials said they were always expecting some sort of response from Iran. The question was just how big and how escalatory it would be. That would determine, obviously, the nature of the then expected U.S. response. If there were to be some sort of second round of strikes, or if this were to be larger than this, or if there were to be some substantial loss of life, it could be significantly escalatory, and you can see a greater U.S. response. Of course, the attack on General Soleimani last week was in retaliation for a number of missile strikes at U.S. bases, including one that killed an American contractor a week and a half or so ago. So, if there was to be loss of life here as a result of the strike, you can certainly expect to see something from the president and potentially a military response in retaliation from the United States.
And Behnam, if you're still with us, obviously, the White House is still trying to assess the damage, and then will then come up with some sort of retaliatory plan. What would, we know now the president has said crossing a line would be American deaths. So we don't yet know if there were any American deaths as the result of either of these attacks. What would then be an Iranian red line? I mean, obviously there is going to be some sort of attack, some sort of retaliation by the U.S. against Iran. What would be a red line on their side to escalate even further?
Well, it depends very much on what is hit by the administration. I think it's highly likely that the Trump administration is going to have some kind of military response. It'd be interesting because the Department of Defense Twitter feed is still saying that they're working out a battle damage assessment. If there are Iraqis killed, because the U.S., when it's in Iraq, is co-located on Iraqi bases because it's part of this coalition. So if there are Iraqi casualties only and no American casualties, it'd be interesting if the U.S. took that as a step down the escalatory ladder and did not respond either against Iran on Iranian territory, or if they chose to respond, restricted its response to Iranian assets and interests outside of the country. I feel like if there is a strike on Iranian territory, then the Iranians would escalate further. There is this Iranian claim, there is this Iranian threat by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that if the country housing the entity that launches the attack, if there is a country that houses the entity that launches the attack is involved, then Iran will retaliate against the interests of that country as well.
I just want to point out, we're rolling some footage from December of 2018. The president was actually there at the Al-Assad Air Base. Zeke, what was the significance of a strike there? Is it more significant because the president was there not too long ago, I guess last year?
It's also one of the biggest U.S. facilities in the region. It's significant to its involvement in the fight against the Islamic State, but also in training and bolstering the Iraqi military. So to the extent that Iran has been trying to diminish the U.S. troop presence in the region and undercut American influence as part of its broader regional efforts, that making it not a surprising target from that standpoint. But obviously, the symbolic factor that the president visited over Christmas in 2018, and also I was there with Vice President Mike Pence about 6 weeks ago, right before Thanksgiving, there and Erbil. So these are major U.S. facilities, which is why you see senior officials going there over and over again.
Right, and why I guess when we heard from Jeffrey McCausland, he was sort of surprised at the strength of these attacks, or sort of the escalation of these attacks. It was more than he'd expected. Behnam, are you also surprised?
Yes, a little bit. The Iranians, again, when they have launched ballistic missiles during peacetime from their own territory, they've done it against a non-state actor, and they've done it against twice, ISIS in Syria, and once against a Kurdish dissident group in northern Iraq. Neither time did they ask the national government for permission. They've done it there, but they've never struck another state operating in another state during peacetime. So this would be a fundamentally different shift for them. Moreover, this is ballistic missiles, not rockets or mortars, so there's this is actually a weapon of war. This is a tool designed to kill Americans, to send a political message, to send a deterrent message that you shouldn't try to respond to Iran's response. And so I think this is the Iranians willing to telegraph that this came from our territory, that we are responding to this development.
Right.
And part of what may be feeding this desire to publicize is that they think the Trump administration may not escalate, or that they think that they have something to gain at home on the home front, and to further work towards that rally around the flag effect that we talked about.
And quickly, Benham, what has Iraq's response been so far? Have we heard anything from the government?
I haven't heard anything, but as has often been the case, Iraq is stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
Iraq is caught between this larger game of competition for Baghdad's hearts, heads, and minds because of this zero-sum competition between America and Iran. And that does not look like it's going away anytime soon.
Right.
It's going to continue in 2020, regardless of how the administration responds to this strike.
And is Iraq likely to respond to Iran if Iraqis are killed?
I don't think so. I think they may write that off as collateral damage, for lack of a better word. The Iranians, of course, may say that this is because, you permitted your country to be used as a base against us. But I don't think the Iraqis who are pro-Iran in that country, and that is a lot of the political class, but not all of it, would even look to publicize that.
Right. Right. All right. I'd also like to bring in Tara Kopp. She is a National Military and Veterans Affairs correspondent at McClatchy. Tara, thank you so much. On the operations front, what do we know about what has happened so far?
So 3 sites, Al-Assad, Irbil, and Taji, have all been targeted. There are damage assessments being done at all 3 locations. I think that you were just talking about the importance of Al-Assad. It's very important to underscore how important Irbil is to the U.S. because it's not only where it has been focus of a lot of its Northern Iraq Kurdish partner training, but also a major point of supply and communication to U.S. forces that are serving in Syria. So that's, that base has dual importance. I think everybody right now is waiting to see what the damage assessment is and to see about casualties. There are some early reports that there have been Iraqi casualties. There's no reports so far on U.S. casualties. But at this, at that point, I think as your previous guest was saying, additional American casualties is a real red line for this administration, and it could see another escalation.
And we don't yet know how Iraqi casualties would factor into that calculation. But looking forward, where does the U.S. response go from here? Obviously, as you said, the assessment is still being made. But once that assessment is made, how quickly is the U.S. likely to respond? Do you think we could see some response tonight?
I think that they would be very cautious in a response and a calculated response to make sure that, it's those uncalculated moves that drive everybody into an unintended war.
Right.
There are all sorts of assets throughout the region between the USS Bataan with its 2,200 Marine Expeditionary Unit forces. There are new B-52s on Diego Garcia that can strike Iran. There are thousands of additional ground forces that have been moved into the region. So there are a lot of options available to the U.S. And we tonight, just as these attacks were happening, our McClatchy paper, the Sacramento Bee, was able to break an exclusive interview with the widow of the U.S. contractor that was killed in Kirkuk on December 27th. And just to remind everyone, it was that U.S. contractor's death and then the injuries to the 4 U.S. service members that became almost a launching pad, a catalyst. Like, that was a bridge too far, that these Iranian proxies had now been targeting and hitting and inciting injuries on Americans themselves. They have been injuring and killing Iraqis in a lot of these attacks, but that had not driven the type of response that you saw when we did the drone strike on Soleimani. His widow, it was a young couple, it was Iraqi Americans. They had both come to the U.S. in 2011, live in a single bedroom apartment in Sacramento, and our Sacramento reporters were able to walk the neighborhood, talk to them, and had this heartbreaking interview with the widow, learning, well, what's next for her. And she literally was saying, do you want to go back to Iraq? And no, it's what is there left for her?
Right. Oh, that is heartbreaking. Oh, thank you so much, Tara Kopp, for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis joins me now on the phone. Hi, Olivia. What is the latest you can tell us?
Hi, Tanya. Well, I can tell you that our intelligence agencies have, of course, been tracking any and all retaliatory options that Iran was expected to pursue, and everybody had been on full alert and prioritizing force protection in the region. A strike of this sort requires vehicles and personnel to move around and prepare, so it's likely that we had decent visibility into the fact that it was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm taking a look at an assessment of Iran's military capabilities put out by the Defense Intelligence Agency, and it is worth noting that Iran is known to have the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. So it has this big inventory of missiles with different ranges, close range, short range, medium range, and we don't yet know, I don't think, what kinds of missiles were used in this attack. We'll expect to get more details on that later. It's also worth noting that Iran, among the menu of options that the Iranians were expected to pursue were these regional attacks on U.S. military and diplomatic interests. So we did anticipate this sort of thing. I think it is notable that these were launched from mainland Iran, as the Pentagon earlier confirmed. So we'll see if this is the first step of many retaliatory responses, but it is a notable first step that the Iranians have taken here.
Now, it's quite a distance from the Al-Assad air base and the Iranian border. Were these missiles not detected prior to impact?
I'm not sure that we know exactly that information as yet, Tanya, but some of these missiles that the Iranians are known to have can travel up to 2,000 kilometers. They can make it as far as Israel, of course, and southeastern Europe. So it's not sort of out of
right.
It's not out of the range of possibilities that they have.
Right.
Artillery that will make this cover this distance.
Okay, Olivia, thank you so much. Please stand by, if you will. I also want to bring in Robbie Grammer. He's a diplomacy and national security reporter at Foreign Policy. So, Robbie, what's been the diplomatic response so far? I mean, I know we're still assessing damage, and there will certainly be a military response forthwith, but what has been the diplomatic response?
Hi, Tanya. Thanks. Well, right now, obviously, it's still in the initial aftermath. Reportedly, Trump's national security team, including Secretary Pompeo, is meeting at the White House. But earlier today, Pompeo spoke to reporters and said that the Trump administration was prepared to respond to retaliation in any form from Iran, saying in event the Iranians make another bad choice, the president will respond in a way that he did last week, which was decisive, serious, and messaged. And so I think what we're going to see right now, in the immediate aftermath is the team coming together, consulting with allies and having, charting a path forward, keeping in mind that a lot of the allies and obviously the government in Iraq are incredibly afraid of how this could escalate and potentially stumble into a broader conflict between Tehran and Washington.
Yeah, give us a sense of what American allies must be thinking right now in the initial aftermath of this. I mean, we do know that some American allies were withdrawing their troops from Iraq as a result of the attack on General Soleimani. What must they be thinking at this point?
Well, the foreign diplomats that I've been talking to, everyone agrees that Iran is this destabilizing force in the region, but they're really nervous right now. We saw NATO withdraw its military training mission in Iraq. We've seen allies like Britain and Canada either prepare to withdraw or move troops. So they're urging restraints on both sides now, and also reaching out to the Iranians, to the Iranian foreign minister, engaging him in Brussels to try to find an off-ramp to this escalation.
And how is Iraq responding? Has there been any response from the government? How is this playing out on Iraqi news stations?
Well, right now there hasn't been. I think it's too soon to tell what the official Iraqi response will be. But from some of the experts and Iraqi officials I've spoken to, this just confirms a lot of their worst fears that Iraq is going to be caught in the crossfire here of this escalating tension and conflict between the United States and Tehran. I can't directly confirm, but there have been reports of Iraqi casualties already in the initial aftermath. Though the U.S. is still doing its damage assessments, and there haven't been any reports yet of any casualties of U.S. service members.
Right. And is Iraq likely to respond to these casualties? Who are they likely to blame for them?
It's difficult to say. I think it's true that the U.S.-Iraqi relationship has really deteriorated quickly since the killing of Soleimani. We've seen the Iraqi parliament call for the expulsion of U.S. troops, and Trump threatening sanctions against Iraq if it does so, which is really unprecedented. And keep in mind, the government, amid all these protests, is in a really precarious position with an acting prime minister. So it's in a really difficult position, but I'm not sure it has much leverage to respond either on the Iraqi or on the U.S. side so far.
And, I want to bring in Ben Taliblu once again. Behnam, I'm still not clear on what exactly the end game is here for Iran.
So I think Iran wants to say that they won't take a strike that killed their most important military figure in the past 40 years lying down. And moreover, they don't want to create the impression that Iran absorbs retaliation, much like the U.S. had absorbed a fair amount of retaliation and escalation from May to December of 2019.
Right, but that's still a temporary, positioning, and that's sort of temporary posturing. What is their ultimate end goal in terms of their relationship with the U.S.?
Well, the relationship is to continue to have a war with the U.S. Iran, in many ways, has been on war footing with Washington since 1979, since the divorce of two friends during the Cold War period into two now very bitter enemies who are actually now at loggerheads physically, it seems like. But the assumption that Iran wanted to send a signal is driven by something larger, and it's driven by Iran saying to America that when you threaten, we'll threaten. There's a Persian saying for this: a missile against a missile. So Iran is trying to reestablish its own deterrence. You've heard the Trump administration talk about trying to deter Iran, trying to limit Iran's freedom of action in the region. This is Iran trying to push back on that and saying, no, we have a free hand in the region. You will not impede our access to the region. And they're choosing a missile, given the capabilities that they have to respond to that. So it's a missile for a missile, a threat for a threat. Even in 2012, when there wasn't any of this going on, when we were a year outside of the interim nuclear deal, Khamenei took to the nation then, and he said a threat against a threat, and that was when Iran launched a couple of foreign terrorist campaigns in response to EU oil sanctions. So Iran does respond with a different tool based on a different threat, but it's always trying to equalize, always trying to create the impression that it will not let one linger.
But how does that serve it? How does it serve the country ultimately, economically?
Economically, Iran is still playing a medium-term game. He knows that this is an election year for Washington. You can look at the Dow price right now. Oil prices have spiked just a bit right now. Iran is trying to dislodge the Trump administration. Let's be clear. Maximum pressure was remarkably effective, but in record time on macroeconomic indicators alone, like GDP, oil exports, value of the currency relative to the dollar. On all these things, the U.S. had accomplished economic pain in Iran unilaterally, not even multilaterally. So the whole point of Iran's escalation campaign since May against the drone, against the oil facilities, is to upend this sanction strategy. And the only way it seems like the strategy will be upended is if there's a different occupant in the White House.
Right.
So the goal is to have this death by 1,000 cuts campaign against Washington, where Washington absorbs escalation and retaliation and says that's not worth responding to, that's not worth responding to, looks weak, absorbs it further, and is ultimately voted out.
Right. All right. So Hunter Walker joins us now on the phone. He's a White House correspondent for Yahoo News. Hunter, I know that you've been reaching out to the Trump administration. What is the Pentagon saying?
Well, right now, as of a few minutes ago, we did not have any information about casualties, but they did confirm that more than a dozen ballistic missiles were launched at these two bases in Iraq. They believe they were launched from Iran. Interestingly, one of the bases, Al-Assad, is actually where President Trump visited last year. So that's pretty much everything we're hearing. Obviously, it's a pretty fast-moving situation, but they have confirmed there was a strike, and we do not have information about casualties.
And pretty much all the top officials, the vice president, secretary of state, everybody is convened at the White House right now?
Yeah, the press secretary, Stephanie Grisham, told me that the president had been briefed. I reached out to her right at the initial reports of the attack, and she also said that he's monitoring the situation. So, I do believe that, we also heard from the DOD that they are following this very, very closely, as you would expect.
Right, but at this point, no additional information about American casualties, and the damage is still being assessed. Is that correct?
Exactly. As of about an hour ago, they were saying that they are still getting battle damage reports. I think, the main question on everybody's mind now is what comes next. I mean, we saw the president in the Oval Office today during his meeting with the Greek prime minister, and, he backed off from this earlier threat he issued this weekend to target Iranian cultural sites because there was a lot of backlash that's actually against international military law.
Right.
But he did say that if Iran, does anything to hit American citizens or American assets, that we would respond, he said, quote unquote, very strongly. So I think the big question on everyone's mind tonight, I'm sure your listeners as well, is sort of when does this chain of retaliation stop, and does it stop at all?
Exactly. Where does it lead? Thank you so much. Behnam, I want to bring you in if you're still there. Is there any speculation about the exact type of missile that Iran used?
There's no official report from Iranian sources or from Washington through the DOD or anything else yet. But if past its prologue here, Iran again has launched single-stage, solid-fueled, short-range ballistic missiles from its territory into Iraq and Syria in 2017 and 2018. The entire class of that family is called the Fateh class, or the Victory class. It's got 4 or 5 different variants. Some of them have a separating warhead. Some of them can carry just under 400, 500 kilos. And they can go up to anywhere from 300 to just under 700 kilometers. So much depends on this. These are road mobile missiles. They're carried towards the border on these things called TELs, transporter erector launchers. So this raises questions of how much did the U.S. see, if anything at all? Was it under the cover of darkness? Was this from a silo, or was this from a TEL? And the type of missile, again, will matter, because this will mean for the first time that Iran used a domestically produced system for such a high-risk, high-publicity attack.
Right. And are we likely to see any response tonight, or is the administration going to sleep on it? We do know that Secretary of State Pompeo is currently at the White House. But is this... Sorry.
I think I saw an unconfirmed report. I'm still waiting for confirmation. The president may speak. I don't know if that's going to be confirmed or not. I saw it roaming around somewhere online. It would simply make sense to address the nation now, especially if there are no casualties on the American side from any battle damage assessments. Again, we're still publicly waiting for that to trickle on down. If there are American casualties, then I think there would be a response in a much shorter time frame.
So what would Iran's off-ramp be here if they decide that the increased escalation is not working for them? How could they pull out of this and save face?
I think it's going to be very difficult for the Iranians to save face if the administration responds on Iranian territory. I think if it's on Iranian territory, there's almost certainly going to be some kind of reaction by Iran. If there's a strike in Iraq or a strike against an Iranian asset elsewhere or offshore, the Iranians could absorb that. The Iranians, of course, may be hoping that there isn't even that, and that Washington absorbs this attack against the Ain al-Assad base in western Iraq.
Right. And right now, I think that we are looking at video. Maybe the producers can clarify. These are missiles from Iranian state TV. So they were launched from Tehran. Of course, we know that this has been reported, all afternoon from Iranian state TV. Behnam, do we know what the story is from the Iranian side? How are they spinning this attack?
Well, spin is a very interesting word. It gets me into media right now because the former secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council, he was the nuclear negotiator at the end of the Ahmadinejad era. also someone very hardline, very zealous. He tweeted, I believe, a picture of the Iranian flag. If you remember when Soleimani was struck by the drone, Trump tweeted a picture of the American flag, and several members of the administration or several other official accounts tweeted the American flag. So this is the Iranians, again, trying to play the media game, trying to play the narrative game. They are very cognizant of how this is being framed abroad. They understand that the West is surprised. They understand that this does not fit with the past mold of Iranian responses, of Iran's traditional method of escalation, hiding its hand, proxy warfare. This is very forward, this is very bold, and they're letting this trickle out into their media. There's even an unconfirmed video that I saw from another military watcher on Twitter that had a picture of Soleimani in the booth in the area where the missiles were launched, so clearly symbolizing that this is in response to the killing of Soleimani. So they're spinning this as retaliatory, they're spinning this as defensive, but again, this is one very large, very costly, very dangerous signaling exercise by the Iranians.
Absolutely. All right, Benham, hang on, if you will, stay with us. I'm going to bring Olivia Gazis back in. Olivia, Esper, Pompeo, and O'Brien are all meeting at the White House right now. What do we know?
Well, we know that they are in the Situation Room, likely reviewing the intelligence that is coming in and discussing what the U.S. does in response, if anything. Of course, the message from this senior leadership has been that de-escalation is the goal. The Secretary of Defense saying today that the goal was not to start a war, but warning that the U.S. will finish one if need be. The president, of course, also said earlier today that the United States was totally prepared to respond to Iraq. But I think it's worth noting that the Iranians fully recognize that they can't compete with the U.S. As in a conventional sort of battle. And so this is the reason that they have historically prioritized these capabilities that are asymmetrical, whether that is cyber warfare, whether that is proxy warfare. And so it may be that they decide that they have exacted enough of a toll here and would stop if the United States stopped too. That will, of course, depend on whether there are any American casualties, which the president has previously said was a red line for the United States. And he has, of course, threatened any number of other measures in the war of words that had mostly ensued immediately following the strike on Soleimani. It will be an outgrowth of their conversation tonight in the Situation Room as to what next steps the United States will take.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Olivia. Let's bring in Dave Sears now. He's a retired Navy SEAL. Dave, what can you tell us about the choice of retaliation on the part of the Iranians? I mean, they could have done a cyber attack. They could have tried to target a domestic soft target. Instead, they went for something a little flashy, something that they could show on state TV, and something fairly aggressive. What does that tell you?
Well, I think for one, you're right that it is flashy so they can show it on state TV, but I would also caution that we don't know if it's done yet.
Right.
So I would still say that, Israel could be targeted by Hezbollah, those proxies that Iran has there. Saudi Arabia is certainly a right target for Iran as well, and you could see some things in Yemen or the Gulf. We don't know where they're going to go. We don't know if they're going to use any of their asymmetric capabilities yet, or how that plays into it. So hopefully this is the only salvo that they have, or two salvos as we're seeing it, and that they want to make a very public statement to their people that we're getting revenge.
Right.
That's on their side.
And they're hoping, you assume, or we assume, that this is where it ends.
I think that that's what Iran's hoping. I think that would be a huge miscalculation. I just can't see the president, after his speech and drawing the red line at U.S. casualties or U.S. assets coming under targeting.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Do you think that it's one thing if there are some U.S. casualties here, but what if it turns out that there are not?
That'll be interesting on how he's going to deal with that. I still think, these are joint U.S.-Iraqi bases, so there's likely to be equipment, and I think that you are going to see if I had to guess exactly sort of what the president called for, you're going to see a completely disproportionate response from our side. You can't have this, one-for-one type response. I think that what he's likely looking at giving them is a very overwhelming response.
What would that look like?
That would look like completely wiping out their ability to project power. That means ballistic missile targets, so they can't launch any more, naval targets, any possible nuclear targets that they're developing. It could be possible Quds Force locations outside of Iran that are their asymmetric things that are in Syria. We know their bases there. I think it could be a large array of all of the above. And
wouldn't that result,
especially if there's casualties,
wouldn't that result then in just more of a military commitment to the region than this administration really wants, has a stomach for?
I don't think if you actually have that overwhelming response, it completely eliminates Iran's ability to do anything.
Are you talking about sort of shock and awe?
We have that capability. Yeah, no, I mean, we could degrade their capability to the point that they have none. It's not, Iran isn't like the United States. It's not that big. It's not Russia or China. So you could conceivably target all their capability to do things if you really wanted to.
So, and that would be without a regime change, just leaving the government there and just wiping out their military.
Yeah, absolutely. And then saying, okay, leave it to the people. What do you want to do? And I think you would have another effect as well if you stick to military targets, especially as they are in Iran. You can really, really limit any civilian casualties on the populace. And remember, the people aren't super happy with the regime in Iran right now.
No, there have been a lot of protests, yeah.
There's a lot of protests. And so which way do they go on this? If they see, now one of the reasons that they have such a problem with the regime or doing anything about it is, for example, the last protest, I think there were reports of, up to 1,500 Iranian civilians killed, another 2,000 imprisoned. They can't do anything. But if you take out some of this infrastructure that is, Iran's domestic infrastructure as well, the people may see an opportunity to rise up. I don't know that would happen, but the opportunity may be there. Or Iran will have to rebuild so much that they just will not be able to project any power around the globe at all.
Wow.
I mean, that is conceivable.
Well, Dave, that's a pretty dramatic picture that you've painted for us. Hunter, what do you think of the likelihood of that, of the U.S. responding to the point where it just wipes out the military? Not a regime change, but just gets rid of the military.
I mean, I think there's two different things that we have to look at right now. What is the likelihood that the U.S. would respond, and what would happen afterwards? And I think the likelihood that we will respond is very high. As we were saying earlier, President Trump said we would respond, quote unquote, very strongly if any American assets or Americans were targeted. And everyone I've talked to, including sources close to the president, right after the Soleimani killing, were very clear that this was likely going to lead to escalation. I mean, one person said to me, there's a source close to the president, they attacked us, referring to the protest at the Baghdad embassy. We attacked them. They're going to have to respond now. Quote, we are on this path. But the other question is what you were posing before, what would happen and what is this likelihood, and that your prior guest was saying that we would totally wipe out their military and that their people would be sort of rejoicing the American liberators in the street. And I have to say, with all due respect, I remember 2003 when people were making very, very similar arguments about Iraq and Afghanistan, which were much smaller countries with, smaller military capabilities. And I think, if we look at the lessons of history, we are right now playing with a situation that is very similar to the other conflicts we've gotten in the Mideast, and they have not been remotely as easy to extricate ourselves from or end as a lot of people predicted at the outset. So I definitely don't want to be someone predicting that this, is guaranteed to be some kind of tremendous success for us. This is, even the people in the White House are aware this is a very dangerous situation.
Right. I mean, wiping out the military complex would have repercussions far beyond just, just getting rid of their weapons. It would have, economic repercussions. It would have all kinds of infrastructure repercussions, and then we'd sort of be on the hook for, well, what's going to happen to these people, right?
And let's look at what happened in Iraq, right? We did essentially affect regime change there, but a lot of the leadership of the Ba'ath Party ended up becoming the leadership of ISIS. So there's been this ongoing cycle of conflict in the Mideast for 20-something years now, and it's hard for me to envision a situation where this continued escalation in Iran wouldn't just add to that.
Okay, so where will it end then? Where will the U.S. escalation end? Because obviously, if we keep going tit for tat, Iran can't match us. So at some point, we're going to have the final word.
I mean, we haven't had the final word in the Mideast in a long time, but I think, you are right. As I was saying, even sources close to the president kind of expect tit for tat here. One thing that I would note is in, 1988 was really the last time we had this kind of direct military confrontation with Iran. It's called Operation Praying Mantis. And that's when we struck in Iranian territorial waters in retaliation for the mining of the Persian Gulf. And obviously, we were able to sort of de-escalate the tensions at that time. And, earlier this summer, President Trump had this similar situation where the U.S. drone was struck. He had these red lines in his rhetoric, but by his own admission, he didn't want to do a disproportionate response, and he was able to sort of de-escalate then. So, potentially we could de-escalate now, but if we do get into this continued tit-for-tat that seems to be beginning, it's really hard to predict where it ends.
I mean, for the Iranian regime, the importance here was to save face, right? To look as if they struck back, and they struck back hard, because from you're sitting at home in Iran watching state TV, it looks like a big deal, right, on your television set. So could this be, the end of it? Are there sober enough minds in Washington that could say, look, we don't like it, but if there are no American casualties, maybe we let it end here? Is that possible?
Yeah, I think one big question that I have is there any deconfliction channel between the U.S. and Iran now? There have been some reports that Oman and Qatar have tried to sort of act as a go-between. It's not really clear how effective that was. I think one thing, and I'm sure you've brought this up earlier, but I think one thing that it's super important for viewers to understand is just how major of a figure Qasem Soleimani was to the Iranian people. Right. One source close to the president, framed it as, being equivalent to if the Iranians had killed Norman Schwarzkopf, the U.S. general from the first Gulf War. But I think it even goes beyond that. A lot of the people that I'm talking to say that, with his stature in the society, it was almost like, somewhere between Secretary of Defense, Vice President, and Secretary of State all rolled into one. Well, so there definitely is an element of face saving for the Iranians here. And on Fars TV, one of the state TV networks, they are framing this attack as quote unquote revenge.
Right. And I would say that that's the regime's perspective. But as Dave and I were discussing earlier, and Benham and I were discussing earlier, there have been, many elements within Iran that are unhappy with the regime. Some younger people looking for some more civil freedoms. Other, even as Benham was explaining, even sort of blue-collar areas of Iran have now joined these protests, which were largely about a year ago or 2 years ago, more of the elites, protesting. And so I'm just curious how much of that status that you afford to Soleimani really was universal in Iran.
Yeah, I would not purport to be an expert on that at all. I mean, I think obviously we saw the Green Revolution in Iran right at the turn of the last decade. There definitely is opposition to the regime there, which has been pretty brutal to its own people and pretty repressive. But it's just I think as we learned with some of the American adventurism that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan around the beginning of the century, it's just really hard to predict where this stuff goes. I should say I have a little bit of breaking news coming in on my phone right now. The White House press secretary Stephanie Grisham just told me the president is not planning to speak tonight. So it does not sound like we are going to hear from President Trump, at least on television this evening.
All right, interesting. Dave, I want to get your perspective on, these groups that you said that we discussed earlier that were unhappy with the Iranian regime. I mean, on the one hand, has that sort of dissatisfaction or that division in Iranian society,
It's useful to look ahead to tomorrow, guys. I can talk about.
has that sort of gone away now with this unified mourning over this beloved general?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, how much does we know, speaking generally, that wars tend to unify countries and overcome some of their internal domestic happiness. I mean, often countries in the past have used wars to get over domestic problems.
Right.
So how much did, Soleimani was not beloved by all.
Right.
He was a large figure that came from, grew up in the, just post-revolution. The Iran-Iraq war is really where he came to sort of begin to come to prominence. He was injured there and then began working his way up. He's not an real original big player in the revolution, but he does continue on from the Iran-Iraq war. So people were divided, especially because of his role in coming in to squash the student protests. Mm-hmm. So he did play a big role in that, and people knew that. And the understanding, I mean, with all due respect to Hunter, I would never compare Soleimani to Norman Schwarzkopf. It's just not a comparison that's there. The atrocities that he committed throughout his career and how he's done things are pretty well documented. And the way that it works, we can't mirror image our politics with Iran. Iran is a very factional political system. And you have Soleimani, the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, right? Mm-hmm. That is not the only army. They're the guardians of the revolution. Mm-hmm. So Iran also has an army and an Iranian Navy. Then they have what's called the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, that's there to guard the revolution.
Interesting.
Within that segment, you have the IRGC Quds Force. And Quds in Farsi is Jerusalem. That's what Soleimani was in charge of. Mm. And their job is to export the revolution. That's why he's primarily external and does things in Syria, Yemen, Thailand, tries to coordinate assassinations in Washington, D.C. His role is external and stirring all up. And ultimately, just as the name Quds implies, is to take over Jerusalem, take it back. And so now, that formal structure looks one way, but the real structure is he did report the Quds Force did report directly to the supreme leader. So they were very close and very trusted agents of each other. And he had an outdue amount of influence. Now, that also leads to jealousies and things like that within the regular Iranian army of the IRGC and of the Quds Force and his power. So there's a lot of factional politics at play in Iran all the time. The IRGC as well, with parts of the Quds Force, controls large pieces of the economy. I mean, they have taken over huge amounts of the economy. So the people look and see them as part of the economic engine, part of the piece that's holding them back. Mm-hmm. And they watch Soleimani spend all this money in Syria, in Yemen, on Hezbollah, in Lebanon, mm-hmm. and they're in economic straits, and they're going, what are we doing? And that's where a lot of these protests started coming from.
Right.
So how much is this galvanized? I'm not.
It's so interesting because that is exactly, the sort of the portion of the population that the revolution was supposed to serve were sort of the poorer, disenfranchised areas, and now they're the ones who are, like you said, watching that spending and feeling infuriated by it.
That's right, but you can, the people see where it's going because it's informative for anybody who's, watching or listening or whatever to take the time and read the Iranian Constitution. This tells you what Iran is about mm-hmm. and the goals of the country. And one of those enduring goals is to export the revolution. And in order to do that, you're going to constantly be doing things in the region, constantly involved with Lebanon, constantly involved with Hezbollah. So you're right. I mean, one of the biggest problems with revolutionaries is when they win, they have to govern, and all of a sudden they're like,
how can we remain as revolutionaries when we're now the establishment, right?
Way easier. You can go to Venezuela and see the same thing.
Exactly. Exactly. All right. Well, Dave, I want to bring in Olivia Gazis now, because Olivia, I understand you have some new information for us about what's going on at the White House.
Well, mainly, Tanya, I just wanted to send a reminder that, once these conversations end tonight, they're going to have to make a decision about what happens with these all-hands congressional briefings that are expected to take place tomorrow. Of course, the entire House and the entire Senate is expecting to hear from the Defense Secretary, the Secretary of State, the Director of the CIA, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's unclear if they will have their hands tied, but Congress has been pretty vehemently, at least Democrats, demanding some answers and demanding some transparency into the series of decisions and the intelligence underlying the strike on Soleimani to begin with. There have been some calls by Democrats to declassify the notification that the president sent to Congress about the strike, essentially saying that the public has a right to transparency into that decision and to get some answers as to what the strategy is from here. To answer the question of why now did we act on Soleimani? If in fact these were extraordinary circumstances and an attack was imminent, what were they? And then to say, how do you get on the off-ramp here? Of course, we heard that the Secretary of Defense indicating today that the exquisite intelligence, that very sort of valuable intelligence that cannot be shared with the entirety of the Congress, was only shared with the Gang of Eight, which received a briefing today. We know that there were some senior administrations of officials letting the congressional leadership and the heads of the respective intelligence committees know what they knew about the impending strike attacks that Soleimani was apparently planning. And likely they discussed any intelligence about what might have been forthcoming from Iran in the coming days. It's not clear whether they had perfect visibility into what is happening tonight, but I would suspect that given how much would have to have been put into place in order for Iran to carry out an attack like this, they would have been sharing that intelligence with, again, that congressional leadership and intelligence committee leadership today.
And so we can assume then that tomorrow lawmakers will also get a briefing on the very latest damage assessment, correct?
That is the expectation. I don't know that those plans have been upended yet. Of course, if there is a need for the Secretary of Defense to be at the Pentagon and the Director of the CIA to be at Langley, they're likely not going to take the time to come to Congress. However, lawmakers, have been, as I said, pretty adamant that they need answers. Of course, if it is a national security emergency and there are American lives at risk, that's going to take a front seat to any congressional briefings. But I am sure that those, especially in the aftermath of this attack, those calls by congressional leadership to have the administration explain its decision-making and its strategy from here are only going to intensify.
All right, Olivia Gazis, thank you so much for that update. And we're going to bring in now CBS News foreign correspondent Ian Lee. Ian, rockets were launched near the U.S. consulate in Irbil, very close to where you are. What's the latest on the ground there?
Well, Tanya, it's a really fluid situation right now. People are just waiting to see if there's going to be another barrage of rockets. I think those two rockets, we heard them actually a little after 1 in the morning here, local time. We heard two loud explosions. Those were just north of the consulate. What we're hearing, though, is there no casualties have been reported, and far north of the consulate, not in the general vicinity. Our team went out there to check the consulate, and it was fairly calm around there, no sense of emergency. So it seems like those missiles landed quite far north of the consulate, north of the American military presence here in Erbil. But the question now is, are there going to be more? And that's something that they're going to be watching closely tonight. Is there more going to be incoming? And then how is the United States government going to respond to that? And I can tell you also tonight, we heard helicopters flying over Erbil too. So again, a very tense evening here.
And Ian, the airbase that was targeted was a coalition base. There weren't only U.S. troops there. Do we know how others are responding?
Well, right now, it really is just wait and see what's going to happen. We're expecting the president to talk potentially a little later to kind of give us an update of what's going on. But right now, what we're hearing about, at least from that base, they're assessing the damage, assessing what happened. We haven't heard of any casualties at the Al-Assad Air Base, which is west of Baghdad, about 100 miles. But you said it is a coalition air base. We are hearing reports that, before this happened, that other members of the coalition party were figuring out ways to leave Iraq after the Iraqi parliament said that they want all foreign troops out of the country. But one thing also we're going to be watching this evening is we're hearing the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, threatening regional allies that if somehow they're mixed up in all this, that Iran is saying that they're willing to target them as well. So a lot of countries in this region, a lot of them are on edge tonight, just watching these latest developments.
All right, Ian Lee in Erbil, Iraq, thank you so much for that. David Martin joins me now from the Pentagon. He is a CBS News senior national security correspondent. David, what's the very latest on this fluid situation?
Well, the latest is that the attacks occurred, more than a dozen ballistic missiles, and now the U.S. is, quote unquote, evaluating what its response will be. But the U.S. has been warning for days now that Iran would be held responsible for any attack against American interests. And here you have an attack launched directly from Iranian territory on two bases where American troops are located. So I don't think there's any doubt that this attack crosses a red line and will draw a retaliatory strike. And the question really is the retaliatory strike going to be limited in scope to just the missile base, for instance, which fired these missiles, or is it going to be a much broader attack which goes after headquarters of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, for instance, since that is the military unit that launched these strikes. All that is still in play right now, as is any assessment of how much damage was done to these bases by these missiles. The Pentagon is saying very little about that for the simple reason that it doesn't want Iran to know whether their attack met with any success. So the fact that the Pentagon is saying it is still evaluating battle damage is really just a placeholder on what really happened.
So you're saying that at this point the Pentagon knows exactly how much damage there was?
Well, they certainly have reports of how much damage there was. One of the first things that would be reported is the extent of casualties, because of course you'd need medical assistance, and we just haven't heard any reports one way or the other.
Now, if there are American casualties, however, that will presumably be reported, correct?
Oh, yes. Whenever an American is, a member of the American military is killed, it gets reported. And I'm not suggesting that anybody was killed. And
right.
Our initial reports were that there were no casualties, and you heard Ian say the same thing. But I'm just saying we have no official word
right.
from the Pentagon on whether there were casualties.
And now that will make a big difference, though, won't it, David, as to what the U.S. response will be, whether or not there are U.S. casualties?
Well, I think the red line has been crossed regardless of whether there were American casualties. This was a direct attack on U.S. troops. That's a cause for war. Mm-hmm. So if U.S. troops were killed or injured, I think that would increase the scope of what the U.S. plans to do in retaliation. But I think the red line has been crossed.
All right, David Martin at the Pentagon, thank you.
Sure thing.
Let's bring in now CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Jiang, then CBS News foreign correspondent Holly Williams joins me from Baghdad, and CBS News senior foreign correspondent Elizabeth Palmer who is in Tehran. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Holly, let me start with you. What's the latest on the ground there?
So we've had these two attacks that we're aware of, one on Al-Assad Air Base, which is about 100 miles northwest of here, and one on the Irbil base, which is about 200 miles north of here. They are both clearly very attractive targets for the Iranians. We've visited the Irbil base on multiple occasions. It's very big. A lot of American investment, a lot of American personnel, and a lot of U.S. aircraft. So you can see why the Iranians might choose to target it. Remember that U.S. troops here in Iraq that number about 5,000 were already on high alert, and they had paused their operations here against ISIS, fearing some kind of a revenge attack by Iran.
And Elizabeth, what more can you tell us about what's happening where you are?
Well, for a start, Americans know a lot more about these attacks than the Iranians do. It happened in the middle of the night. It's just after 5 now, and the sun is not up. People who will have been watching early morning TV will have seen the Revolutionary Guard having posted a statement claiming responsibility for this attack, saying explicitly that it was a reprisal for the killing of Commander Soleimani. And the guards have also posted video of what they say are the outgoing missiles being fired from Iran. The missile is a surface-to-surface missile, a well-known weapon in the arsenal. Perhaps more concerning, the guards are also saying that if the United States responds to this attack, the guards in turn will retaliate. So they're really making an explicit threat of escalation. And we heard from David a couple of minutes ago that he believes the U.S. will respond. So this is looking like a very dangerous situation that could in fact get a lot worse.
Absolutely. And Weijia, you are there in Washington. Do we have any more information about how the administration might respond to this attack?
We know that President Trump has been meeting all night long in the Situation Room with Vice President Mike Pence, Secretary of Defense Mark Esper, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and his National Security Advisor. And so far, we have not heard anything from the president online or in person. And CBS News has just learned that he will not be making any sort of formal remarks tonight from here at the White House. But certainly the question is what their next move will be. And we know that this is something they've already been mapping out, anticipating that Tehran would respond in some sort of way. Today, during a string of rare press conferences, in fact, all 3 of those people who I just mentioned, aside from Vice President Mike Pence, gave rare press conferences to say that if Iran were to do anything, were to make bad decisions, that this administration would be ready to respond. And I think part of the reason why we are not hearing from the president tonight is because they still have to decide exactly what that looks like and weigh the potential consequences, because Democrats on Capitol Hill are already publicly expressing their concerns that this could only be the beginning, that there could be a tit for tat. And, you know, if the U.S. responds as it promises to do, what will Iran do next? We know that the vice president has briefed House Speaker Nancy Pelosi along with Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and they are publicly speaking out as well, with Pelosi saying that these needless provocations from the administration have to stop because America and the world cannot afford war. And so it's an extremely tense situation here at the White House with really no answers as the president continues to huddle. But I can tell you, Tanya, that in light of these escalating tensions, the U.S. Secret Service has beefed up its presence here at the White House.
And Weijia, we know that lawmakers were all set to get a briefing on that original attack against General Soleimani, and that was supposed to happen tomorrow. Is this briefing still going to take place as scheduled, and will it now include more information about the damage done by these 2 attacks and the retaliation planned?
Well, as far as we know, it is still on as scheduled. Just today, the White House briefed the Gang of 8 of congressional leaders with classified information regarding that Soleimani attack. But certainly, if that happens tomorrow, as it's expected to, there will be brand new questions about what has now developed and what the administration plans to do moving forward. You know, Pelosi is planning to take a vote, was planning, perhaps still is, especially in light of what happened, to take a vote on a resolution to limit President Trump's military actions against Iran. And so these are issues that definitely Democrats will be raising because they are concerned that, number one, it was not worth it to take out Soleimani, given the residual danger that we are already seeing now. And number two, they want to stop potential escalation because even though the president and his cabinet members have said the ball is in Iran's court to de-escalate, you know, many critics of the administration are arguing that the U.S. has to de-escalate as well. And so they have to somehow come to a compromise before we frankly do end up in war.
All right. Weijia Jiang at the White House, thank you. And our thanks to Elizabeth Palmer and Holly Williams as well. We're going to bring back in Hunter Walker. Hunter, you know, we just heard from Weijia about, you know, the huddle that's taking place at the White House and the calculations that are going to be made tonight and the briefing that lawmakers are set to get, you know, from officials about that first strike. And now there are going to be very different questions regarding that first strike. I mean, I think lawmakers wanted to ask, what's the plan in place for the response? And now we've seen the response. So a lot is going to be, you know, compiled in tomorrow's briefing. How do you expect Democrats will respond to this?
Yeah, well, I think it's an issue for it's an issue for Democrats on the Hill. And we're already seeing our first indications that it's an issue for Democrats on the 2020 campaign trail. Vice President Joe Biden was at a fundraiser tonight, and it was in the suburbs of Philadelphia. And according to Julia Taruso, the local pool reporter for the Philly Inquirer, he briefly addressed the strikes while, you know, prefacing it by saying he didn't have many details and he only wanted to speak generally. Joe Biden's comment was that, quote, what's happening in Iraq and Iran today was predictable. Not exactly what's happening, but the chaos that's ensuing. And he blamed Trump for withdrawing from the nuclear deal and also for the killing of Soleimani. Mm-hmm. He said of Trump, quote, some of the things he's done and said in the meantime have been close to ludicrous, including threatening to bomb holy sites. And I just pray to God as he goes through what's happening as we speak, that he's listening to his military commanders for the first time, because so far that has not been the case.
Right.
So I think Biden's comments are really indicative of how we're going to see Democrats, you know, really criticize President Trump for the escalation here.
Well, let's just drill down for a second on that threat by President Trump that was widely criticized, that threat to attack, you know, national or, you know, religious artifacts or institutions in Iraq. I believe the administration has backed down. I think Mark Esper was asked about that at one point, and he said that would constitute a war crime, and we don't commit war crimes. And I believe the president may have said something today that indicated he was backing down from that specific threat as well. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, so, you know, what happened was over the weekend, the president tweeted that, you know, the U.S. had 52 sites in Iran, representing the 52 hostages that were taken at the U.S. Embassy during the revolution there, and that these sites, you know, were ready to be targeted in the event of any Iranian retaliation. Now, that immediately prompted a bit of a backlash because a lot of people, you know, said that it's against military law to target cultural sites.
Right.
So the president did back away from that. What he said in the Oval Office today, I have it right in front of me, was we are, this is a quote from President Trump, we are, according to various laws, supposed to be very careful with our cultural heritage. And you know what? If that is what the law is, I like to obey the law.
Right.
But think of it. They kill our people, they blow up our people, and then we have to be very gentle with their cultural institutions. I'm okay with it, but he said if Iran does anything that they shouldn't be doing, they're going to be suffering the consequences, and very strongly.
Right. That's
so he did seem to back away from the specific threat to cultural sites, but he certainly didn't back down from, you know, the red line with Iran.
No, absolutely. It's sort of a sorry, I'm not sorry kind of response. And in terms of a response that the White House might be framing today? We just heard David Martin at the Pentagon saying that he believes that this attack, whether or not American lives were lost, constitutes a crossing of the red line that the White House was talking about. What can we infer from the president's tweets and what he's said about the strength of the retaliation that might follow? Because in some ways, he may have boxed himself into a bit of a corner with some of the language that he's used.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to gauge what the president's going to do on this. In Syria, we saw him drop the quote-unquote mother of all bombs at one point when he was interested in retaliating, but against something ISIS had done. But, as I was discussing earlier, there was this incident with the drone strike where Iran shot down one of our drones earlier this summer, and it seemed to violate his red line, but he did back down from that. Mm-hmm. And certainly on the campaign trail in 2016, he kind of indicated he would get us out of what he called, quote unquote, endless wars in the Mideast.
Right.
But as I was alluding to earlier, sources close to the president told me right after the killing, that they saw Soleimani as a very major Iranian military leader. They made the comparison to Schwarzkopf, and they said that put us on the quote-unquote path. And they expected both retaliation from Iran and then a response from Trump. I think the real question that's going to come up with Democrats on the trail and on the Hill as we look at potential further escalation here is, what was this supposed intelligence that prompted the strike against Soleimani?
Right.
And my colleague Jenna McLaughlin has just published a story saying that Saudi officials warned of a cyber attack literally on the day of that strike. And that this warning, it didn't definitively accuse Iran, but experts believe that Iran was behind that cyber attack. Now, it's not clear that that's what prompted the killing of Soleimani. I don't think a cyber attack is the kind of imminent threat that the president has implied it was. But, when he was speaking in the Oval today, they actually asked the president, what was this intelligence that led you to make the decision to kill Soleimani? And Trump's comment was not an answer. He said, look at what he was planning. Right now it's classified. Mm-hmm. So I think that's going to be one of the bigger questions that we see emerge this week. What was this intelligence, and can the White House explain why they took this drastic step?
Well, that's what lawmakers are supposed to hear tomorrow, so we'll see. Hunter, thank you so much. Let's bring in now Catherine Herridge. She is the senior investigative correspondent for CBS News. Catherine, how did what we heard from Secretary Esper earlier today set the table for what we're seeing play out?
Well, at the news conference at the Pentagon earlier today, Secretary Esper really provided new detail and a lot of granularity about the intelligence that led to the strike last week. He was asked a question on whether this was imminent or an active plot, and he said it would be fair to say it was days, not weeks away, and that he was also very specific about General Soleimani, saying, I'm using the language he used, he was in Baghdad to coordinate attacks. So again, that tells you that the administration had assessed, based on multiple intelligence streams, that this was a plot, as I said today, that was in its final stages. A couple of other points, Tanya, that really stood out from Esper's news conference. He said Iran will retaliate. That was the expectation of the United States. And the backstory there is that we had reporting from my colleague David Martin at the Pentagon just about an hour or two before that, that military officials were very concerned by what they called as troubling movements of military Iranian assets in the region. And then also, finally, Secretary Esper offered what appeared to be a very public off-ramp for the Iranians. He said the U.S. was opened to a dialogue and a diplomatic resolution. And I keep coming back to that point because over the weekend, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham told CBS News that he was going to personally urge the president to lay out a roadmap or a pathway to de-escalation. Senator Graham told me that he felt it was important for the president to appear strong, but also, his words, reasonable in the face of what's gone on in Baghdad last week.
And Catherine, are there any reports, I've been reading a few reports, I don't know if they've been confirmed, that Iran has said that if there is no retaliation for this attack, that's it, they're done?
Well, one of the things that caught my attention this evening was, of course, the timing. I always think it's important to look at the timeline and how these events kind of rack and stack. And just about the same time that these missile attacks were launched, we had the statement released by the IRGC, that's the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council, so the umbrella group that's over the military. And they said that this was in revenge for the assassination of General Soleimani. And I reached someone within the White House who told me that they were paying attention to the statement because they felt this was very much for domestic consumption in Iran. This was a way to say to their own people, we are punching back against the United States. And my contact was operating off of very preliminary information, but they said they did not believe that this was the grand retaliatory strike that they had been anticipating or likely anticipating from the Iranians in response to the killing of General Soleimani last week.
So they didn't get the sense that the Iranians were done?
Not earlier today, but again, it's very fluid, so I don't want to go too far and speculate. But when I had my conversation, they said they felt that this was very much for domestic consumption to punch back against the idea that Iran was weak in the face of the United States.
Right. And you've been in contact with your sources within the administration. What is your sense about how quickly they will decide on next steps?
Well, I think you just have to look at the TikTok of events this evening, Tanya. You saw the top national security advisors go directly to the White House and to consult with the president, and the White House was very public about saying the president remain engaged this evening, though at this point we are not expecting any statement or address from the president on the incident this evening. I don't want to speculate, but it seems clear from my reporting that they anticipated retaliation by Iran, and it was not necessarily the case that they would, and these are my words, take the bait and engage, especially in light of Secretary Esper's very public comments that they were urging Iran to take the path of de-escalation, and the U.S. was open to a dialogue with that country.
So it appears then, according to David Martin at the Pentagon, we were talking to him earlier, that, the Iranians did not take that olive branch, as it were, or did not see it as an olive branch.
Well, it certainly doesn't. It certainly doesn't look that way, because when you look at Secretary Esper's comments and then you look at the number of ballistic missiles that the Pentagon says was fired significantly from Iran and not by one of its proxies or not from Syria, which is about 200 miles away from the primary air base that was attacked. So they really took ownership, not only in the launching of the attack, but then again, this very public statement from the IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guards Council. This is the group that's over the military, saying it was us, it was in revenge for General Soleimani. So it was a very specific message to the United States. But again, I would emphasize the importance of the message domestically in that country as well, that they are punching back against the United States in this case.
Absolutely, and that they showed the airstrikes on national TV. It was something that they could put on the airwaves, as it were.
Seemed very choreographed, I would add.
Exactly. Now, did you get the sense that it will be of great significance to the administration whether there were U.S. casualties as a result of these attacks, or that the attacks in and of themselves were sufficient to warrant a response?
Again, in these situations, I don't like to go too far and speculate about what I think. I guess the other issue, if I could draw attention to tonight, is these classified briefings that they've had on Capitol Hill for the leadership, the so-called Gang of Eight. That would be a very highly classified briefing that would get into some of the sources and methods and a lot of granularity about how we obtain the intelligence, who we got it from, our partners in the region, and what we anticipate as next steps from the Iranians. I mentioned that because I'm sure you've noted already in your broadcast that the administration was very quick to notify the congressional leadership about the response from Iran this evening. There was no gap between what was happening almost in real time and that notification, and that seemed to be sort of paying attention to the complaints of the last few days that they had been left in the dark about what was clearly a very serious decision by the United States to take out this general.
Absolutely. All right, well, Catherine Herridge, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Let's bring in now CBS News intelligence and national security reporter Olivia Gazis once again. So, Olivia, let's look at the bigger picture, if you will. How will these attacks impact the Trump administration's national defense strategy more broadly? And I ask that in light of the fact that, there's a tension right now, I think, in the administration between not wanting to enter into any more foreign wars. I mean, nobody has an appetite for that after Iraq. And also, the need to appear strong in the face of Iran's escalating military actions. So where will that balance be struck?
Absolutely, Tanya, and that's a very important point, and something that, of course, the president ran on was this notion that, rather than being mired in the Middle East in these regional conflicts, we were going to step out of it. And a crucial part of his own administration's national defense strategy, this sort of seminal document that is put out annually that lays out a sort of worldview from the Pentagon on the part of the U.S. military, outlined this sort of necessary pivot to what it refers to as great power competition. This notion that the U.S. is in a long-term strategic competition between nations like Russia and China, rising powers, or at least important powers that would need to sort of meet with a U.S. counterbalance as they try to rise to economic and military prominence. There's this notion also that the United States would have to pivot away from its efforts at counterterrorism that it had sort of focused its intelligence and military capabilities on for over a decade. And in order to preserve an international order where the U.S. maintains some kind of dominance, to really invest on maintaining its competitive edge. One other thing that is a sort of a second or third degree effect, not to diminish the immediacy and the urgency of what's going on with regard to Iran, but one of the sort of ancillary effects is that both NATO and the U.S.-led coalition to defeat ISIS have suspended their operations there, raising the very real specter that group could reconstitute in relatively short order. Military and intelligence officials have warned consistently that its propaganda, ISIS's propaganda machine, is still very much alive, and it does not take too much of an opportunity, too big a window for them to effectively, regain at least some clout, if not territory. So that is a very important thing also to keep in mind as the administration plots its next steps here.
Absolutely. That's certainly a complicating factor, but for all players involved, Ben Taliblu is also still with us. He is the senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense Democracies. Benham, if you could weigh in on this question of ISIS, right? Because, ISIS is no friend to Iran, no friend to Iraq, no friend to the U.S., and yet there's tensions among all of these players. So how does that play out?
In the short to medium term, if there is a pause, like we've been hearing as reported for the past 2 days in the counter-ISIS campaign and the counter-ISIL campaign by Washington, NATO, and the international coalition, that could be a boon to Iran. Remember, when the actual campaign, the fighting on the ground by Iraqi security forces and pro-Iran Shia militias, as well as, of course, the U.S. air power above, was going on, Iran used the fight against ISIS to solidify its control. It had basically created the IRGC model in neighboring Iraq. It had paramilitaries that eventually penetrated the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense. And so having a radical jihadist Sunni organization in a neighboring country that has invited you in to help fight that organization permits you both to fight that organization to stop the threat to your country, as well as to make gains in the region on behalf of your own cause. So Iran did that quite skillfully in 2015 and 2016. You can look at some of the battles. They even had some Iran-backed forces in 2014, even had U.S. air cover, very interesting, in smaller towns in Iraq, in places like Jurfal-Fakhr or Amrali, historic to know where that confluence of America and pro-Iran forces converged to fight ISIS there. But in the long run, of course, to have ISIS take over Iraq totally and win would not be in Iran's interest either.
Right. It's not quite the enemy of my enemy is my friend. It's a little more complicated.
Exactly.
So, Benham, if the U.S. doesn't respond, how would the Iranians see that? I mean, at this point, we can probably all agree that it is likely the U.S. will respond. But if the U.S. decides that this was a pound of flesh for a pound of flesh or what have you, how would the Iranians interpret that?
Well, just to be clear and to remind the audience, this tweet storm that is now being defined on this call and on this show as the new U.S. red line has actually been something of a U.S. red line before. Brian Hook, the special representative on Iran, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and also John Bolton, when he was National Security Advisor, talked about threats to America's interests and security for basically a 9-10 month period as being met with overwhelming force. And in each instance, there were threats to America's interests and security in the 2018, early 2019 period, and the U.S. did not respond to overwhelming force. And it really remained status quo until May 2019 when Iran escalated further. So it would not be unprecedented for the U.S. to back down from issuing this red line. In fact, the Trump administration itself has had a tough time sticking to this red line. That's why the events have been moving so quickly since December, because the Iranians did not anticipate this sudden 180 in the Trump administration's posture. But if the U.S. doesn't do it, it's entirely possible that the Iranians would have used this strike. Again, it's a low probability chance, but it's possible that they would have used this strike to respond to the killing of Soleimani and then simply sit it out, meaning if Washington doesn't respond, the Iranians are happy because they feel like they have restored their deterrence, and you go back to a game of escalation, but a much more manageable game of escalation that doesn't look like it's racing towards war anytime soon. It's also possible that weakness, as is the classic thing with authoritarian regimes, is provocative. If the Iranians see that the Trump administration is afraid, well, maybe they'll make good on their threat to respond to a U.S. asset or interest in a different country and say that Trump will not respond.
Or perhaps they would respond with a covert attack that is less easily traced directly to Iran.
True. They can sneak one in, and the U.S. would have to first discover it and then expose it and then show its chain of attribution. All of this takes time, and time permits the opportunity, the mind to cool and de-escalation to set in.
Right. But would you agree, though, that whether or not the U.S. Retaliates here, that Iran is probably motivated to continue its strategy of aggressions, maybe perhaps smaller aggressions, but...
For me, the decision point for Iran in the past year or so was May 2019. Until May 2019, Iran's policy was strategic patience towards America. You can wait out the sanctions pressure. May 2019, their policy became graduated escalation. Meet pressure with pressure, ratchet up the pressure, tit for tat over time. Unless the U.S. confronts you militarily, don't change the course. Now there's the potential for the U.S. to massively confront Iran militarily. If there is a conflict, or if there is a de-escalation by America and Iran senses this is weakness and pounces, then, of course, the policy could become just escalation writ large, where there is no measure or scientific rhyme or reason for why Iran goes from one type of escalation to another. Right now, there's a very clear political rationale. Make it costly for America, make America reconsider the fact that it started this whole conflict, make it reconsider responding to the terror threats about Soleimani, make it reconsider having left the nuclear deal. And so there was a political logic there. If we get to a point where there's escalation quite quickly by both sides, it could be less measured and less politically motivated, and thus lead to an accidental conflict, even though both leaders, President Trump in the U.S. and Khamenei in Iran, have said publicly many times that they don't want a big war.
And so, Ben, if you look at what the Iraqis want out of all of this, what would be the ideal resolution or result for Iraq?
It depends very much on which Iraqi you ask. As of October of last year, countless Iraqis, hundreds of thousands, based on if you just look at some of the videos that you've seen, have been protesting against the Iraqi state. The political class is not representing their views, their wishes, their interests. In addition to corruption, in addition to mismanagement, in addition to resource scarcity, they are blaming the Iraqi government for being reliant on Iran. And the Iraqi government has not shifted to accommodate this blame. And the Iraqi government, the constellation is relatively the same. There probably will be some government change in 2020. So it depends which Iraqi you ask. If you ask the pro-Iran groups in the parliament, they would like to use this as a casus belli to evict America from Iraq. They'll say, you guys co-locate in our bases, you guys in Iran have drama, you guys in Iran have a conflict, kindly leave. And then in so doing, actualize an Iranian national security goal, which is to evict America from the region.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Ben. Benham, please stand by if you will. Let's bring in now Catherine Herridge again. She's the senior investigative correspondent for CBS News. Catherine, what can you tell us about how the Department of Defense is responding?
Well, the Department of Defense issued a very public and detailed statement tonight, Tanya, and what caught my attention is the level of detail, because it seems to lay the groundwork for future action if that is the course that the administration chooses to take. And it states in part a very specific number about the missiles involved. It says more than a dozen ballistic missiles against U.S. military and coalition forces in Iraq. And then it goes that extra step to say the source of the attack, and it says launched from Iran and targeting at least 2 Iraqi military bases. And then it continues further on, the United States will take all necessary measures to protect and defend U.S. personnel, partners, and allies in the region. So that's a lot of specificity in a statement that seems to set the table for a future response if that is the decision the administration ultimately chooses to take, because it puts the ownership and the responsibility of the attack firmly with Iran and not one of its proxies, not one of its militias, and not one of its allies in Syria. Now, if we just kind of go back a little bit to the Oval Office spray with the president today, if you look at the language very carefully, he makes a number of points. He justifies the assassination of General Soleimani, saying that he was a horrible terrorist. He was someone who was responsible, kind of pioneered the idea of IED attacks and suicide attacks against our military personnel in Iraq. And just as an anecdote for you and folks at home, one of my contacts was explaining to me that there was a lot of sort of sweet irony in the fact that General Soleimani was killed on that route coming out of Baghdad International Airport called Route Irish, because this is sort of a 4-lane highway. It's very broad, but it was really one of the most dangerous stretches of road during the surge in Iraq. And it was a place where many U.S. service personnel lost limbs or were killed because of this strategy that was really pioneered by General Soleimani. And then also, I just want to again draw attention to the very specific language the president used at that news conference. He says, quote, if Iran does anything that they shouldn't be doing, they're going to be suffering the consequences, and very strongly. So a very succinct capsulization, if you will, of what his bottom line is. What we don't know tonight, and I don't want to speculate about, is whether the firing of more than a dozen ballistic missiles at these 2 bases that are used by the U.S., Iraqis, and I believe even others, constitutes the crossing of that red line. But we know the president has been meeting with his national security team, so his closest advisors, to make an assessment of what happened this evening and what the follow-on would be for the United States.
And in the event that U.S. lives were lost in these attacks, would at this point, probably the Pentagon knows this information, I would imagine. I mean,
yes, I think that's a fair assessment.
And I think that it's, you know, it will have to be released eventually, but will the information regarding the damage done by these attacks be further ammunition, as it were, for the Iraqi regime to sort of gloat to their people?
Well, I think you make a very valid observation. Nothing is a secret, you know, in the age that we work in now. Everything is on Twitter or on the web in seconds. So we're going to know pretty quickly as we head into morning light in Iraq the nature and the extent of the damage at these sites because of the Iranian attack. And we'll also get a much better sense of whether any individuals were injured in a minor way or a more serious way, or whether there were any fatalities. We don't have any indication of that this evening. I want to be absolutely clear. But any of those details, of course, go to the broader fabric of what kind of decision the U.S. will take when it decides to respond. Obviously, the more aggravating these factors are, the more it makes the case for response. But before the attack this evening, Secretary Esper, again, we talked about this a few minutes ago, but Secretary Esper said the U.S. was open to a dialogue with Iran and de-escalation. I mean, that's not a word the Secretary of Defense uses lightly.
Right.
So to say the least. And he said the onus was on Iran, which I felt was a very clear way of telegraphing that the United States felt the ball was in Iran's court, to use a cliche, and they were going to be one of the main decision makers over how things would transpire over the next few days. But one of my contacts who works within the White House cautioned this evening that the Iranians are extremely smart and they're extremely strategic, and they're also extremely patient. You know, there's a phrase in that part of the world that we have watches, but they have time. Right? You know, so they're extremely patient. I don't want to make light of that, but they're very smart that way. And my contact sense was that significant retaliation by the Iranians might not come until some future date. It might not be immediate.
And very interesting. Well, if that statement by Secretary Esper was meant to be an olive branch of sorts, it was certainly not taken as that by the Iranians. Has there been any reporting that you're aware of that in those statements, those domestic statements that you referenced earlier from the Iranian regime to the people of Iran, you know, discussing the nature of this retaliation, was there any statement or language in it that indicated that perhaps for the Iranian government this could be the only retaliation necessary?
Let me just take a closer look at the language. Again, that statement from the IRGC, which is Iran's Revolutionary Guard Council, so that's sort of the umbrella group that's over the military, says, quote, the brave soldiers of the IRGC's aerospace unit have launched a successful attack with tens of ballistic missiles. So that's an inflated number based on what we know from the Pentagon, on Al-Assad military base in the name of martyr General Qasem Soleimani. So they are elevating his status and saying very specifically it was in his name and in response to his killing last week by the United States. Couple that with the fact that the Pentagon has publicly said these missiles were launched from Iran, again, not from a proxy, not by a militia, not by the Syrians, but from Iranian territory. That really ups the ante there. Though in my experience, I worked overseas for a number of years, you have to take these public statements from the Iranians really with a grain of salt, in the sense that so much of that is meant also for domestic consumption. You know, the kind of we're punching back against the United States, which they did this evening. Let's be clear about that. They did punch back in a very significant way. What we don't know, and I don't really wish to speculate on, is whether that's going to be enough for the United States to further escalate the tensions in the Gulf. Right.
And Catherine Herridge, thank you so much for that. I believe we still have Benham and Olivia standing by. Benham, I want to ask you about what Catherine was referencing earlier, the statement from Secretary Esper before these attacks that suggested that, you know, the U.S. was hoping to de-escalate things, that, you know, that they were opening a path to dialogue. How likely would it be that the Iranians would accept that path?
You know, there are a few times in the history of the Islamic Republic when they've done a 180 on a key national security prerogative. And the Iranians can accept dialogue, but the conditions under which they do that is imperative to note, because pressure has to build and build and build and build. And then only when they feel like they've got their back against the wall, if they're offered an off-ramp, then they'll look for it and then they'll take it. And that's somewhat like how the Iran-Iraq war, which went on for 8 years, that's how it was ended. And I liken so much of the max pressure campaign of the Trump administration to a lot of the political and economic and even some of the military conditions that existed during the Iran-Iraq war. That remains in the history of the Islamic Republic the blueprint for both war-making and peacemaking with the Islamic Republic. And it's important to keep offering Iran publicly a lot of these off-ramps. You know, in Washington, it may not be fashionable to look at the way the president has been tweeting about Iran, not, you know, recently, but in 2018 when the sanctions were being restored, because as he was restoring sanctions, he kept saying, I'd like to meet Rouhani, I'd like to meet Rouhani. And while there was criticism from the president's right flank, inside the country, inside Iran, that was seen as a positive, because the Iranian people were able to then chastise their own leaders and say, look, you're not even doing what North Korea did. You're not even sitting down with Washington. Why are you so ideological? Why are you so opposed? why are you doing things to cause more pain for us? And that created a domestic source of pressure on the regime, and that was a boon to the administration's maximum pressure policy. So again, Iran negotiates very rarely earnestly, but only under conditions of massive pressure. And now Iran is feeling ascendant. It is feeling like it got a major lick in against the United States. It did cross the red line, as the president said on Twitter. It did have a summer of escalation against U.S. interests and assets and allied interests and assets and security in the Persian Gulf. But they haven't taken the off-ramp yet. One wonders if they are going to feel empowered if the U.S. doesn't respond, or if they're going to feel like they've gotten the message in and they're willing to absorb the rest of America's escalation, which could be sanctions, it could be covert, it could be cyber, it could be psychological warfare. Who knows? But that kind of language where the Secretary of Defense tells me that it's not the U.S. that's looking to rush to war. The U.S. is still being very, very, very judicious here.
All right. Behnam, thank you so much for that. We have team coverage here. Let's bring in CBS's Natalie Brand, CBS News senior intelligence correspondent Catherine Herridge, and CBS News foreign correspondent Ian Lee. He is in Iraq. So, Ian, let me start with you. You are on the ground there. Can you tell us what's the latest? What time is it there, first of all?
Well, right now it's just getting to be about 5:30 in the morning. This attack happened about 4 hours ago. We heard it with the two explosions here in Irbil. After that, we also heard helicopters in the sky. And just a little while ago, we also heard a fighter jet overhead. So it's still fairly tense here. Now, we understand that these two missiles landed north of the U.S. consulate, away from the U.S. military presence here. We haven't heard of any casualties. We had a team that went by the consulate to see if there was any action there. It seemed fairly calm from what we could see. So right now, there's just a lot of anticipation of, is this over, or is there going to be another round that's going to be incoming? Right now, really, no one knows.
Had security there been beefed up? Were these attacks anticipated at all?
You know, we've heard statements from the Iranian government. We heard them from Shiite militias here in Iraq that they are going to retaliate. They're going to retaliate with vengeance. Americans were anticipating this. But what's interesting is a few days ago, we heard from one of the Iraqi militias, Hezbollah, that warned Iraqi soldiers around these bases to stay a kilometer away, so a little over a mile away from the U.S. military presence. Now, was that a warning that the Iranians were going to strike, or was that another warning? That was, though, a warning that something looked to be coming down the line. So that could be part of it also. You know, something also that's interesting that we're hearing is the difference in numbers. So the Iranians are saying that tens of missiles were fired. The Americans are saying a little over a dozen. I was in Saudi Arabia when the Aramco oil refinery was hit, and something that we saw that the Saudis showed us was that some of these munitions that were fired were duds. They fell in the desert. They didn't make it as far. And so possibly that's one theory why these numbers aren't matching, is that maybe a number of those rockets that were fired were duds that landed just in the desert. So something that they'll probably be looking in the desert to see if there are any that just fell short of their target.
Right. All right. Well, Ian Lee, thank you so much for reporting for us from Iraq there. Thank you so much. And Natalie Brand, I want to go to you next. How is Capitol Hill reacting to the news? And we understand that several lawmakers have been briefed. Is that correct?
That's right. The Democratic leaders were called by the vice president. That's Minority Leader Chuck Schumer in the Senate and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Our Hill producer Rebecca Kaplan reports that Speaker Pelosi actually found out when she was handed a note during a regularly scheduled meeting, and she told members in that meeting to pray. We know that following that, she did have a conversation with the vice president. Now, Minority Leader on the House side, Kevin McCarthy, says he spoke to the president, according to an aide. We still don't exactly know what lawmakers know detail-wise about this attack. And of course, congressional leaders here and the White House closely monitoring this very fluid situation. But across all sides, the main message here is the first and immediate concern is for U.S. troops in the region and, of course, coalition partners.
Natalie Brand on Capitol Hill, thank you so much. And Catherine, what more do we know about how the administration is responding?
Well, we've had information from the White House this evening that the president has remained engaged and he's met with his national security team, the Secretary of State, his national security advisor, as well as the defense secretary. And we've heard publicly from the defense secretary and the Secretary of State earlier today. The defense secretary was very clear about the quality of the intelligence they had, and in his view, how it pointed to an imminent or very active plot targeting U.S. interests in the region. Asked how imminent it was, he said it was fair to say it was days and not weeks away. He also said, and this was new information, that General Soleimani was in Baghdad. Remember, he had been traveling regionally. He had been to Beirut, he had been to Damascus, and then he had come into Baghdad very late at night into the early hours of Friday. And that is when he was targeted. And Secretary Esper said that Soleimani was in Baghdad, his words, to, quote, coordinate attacks in the area. So he was taking a very active role in this plot. And that's consistent with information we had here at CBS News from a senior U.S. government official when the strike happened last week. They said Soleimani was personally overseeing and steering an active plot against U.S. interests in the region. Just as sort of a final footnote, one of the things I learned through my reporting today is that after the Soleimani strike, there was what's called in intelligence circles a spike in the chatter. And what that means is that when you have operatives who are, in this case, allied with the Iranians or General Soleimani or the militias or in Syria or in Lebanon, they get on their phones, they get on their computers, they start text messaging, they're on social media. I mean, their comms networks really light up, and that's what they call a spike in the chatter. And this is almost, in some ways, a real gift for intelligence analysts because it allows them to scoop up that information and start to identify new potential leads. And I just can't emphasize enough how good the U.S. military is, as well as the signals intelligence people, as well as the special operators, at identifying the source of those communications and then really latching into it and not letting go of it until they decide it's a target or it's not a target. And when you think about that kind of language and those steps, that's really what we saw with General Soleimani last week. We were on him for several days as he traveled in the region. Then he came into Baghdad, and that was the moment that the administration decided to take that strike. It was described to me as a clean shot.
Wow, a clean shot. All right, let's also bring in CBS News White House correspondent Weijia Jiang. Weijia, what's the latest you can tell us coming out of the White House?
Well, we know that President Trump was huddled here in the Situation Room with his national security team along with the vice president. But so far, we have not heard from the president himself about these Iranian attacks, because on the one hand, of course, it would take longer than just a matter of hours for him to decide his next move with his team and then announce it to the country and the world. But on the other hand, you know, they were anticipating this. Officials came out today and said they knew that Iran was probably going to retaliate in some way or another, and that the U.S. would be ready to respond appropriately. President Trump did say earlier today that if Iran does anything that they shouldn't be doing, they're going to be suffering the consequences, and very strongly. Of course, what exactly he means right now is the answer that everybody is waiting for, because as Democrats already point out on Capitol Hill, that will determine what happens next in Tehran and whether this will continue to escalate and how serious it could become. But certainly already these consequences are potentially dire, and congressional leaders are publicly voicing their concerns about what this means. As for the president, again, we are closely monitoring his Twitter feed because often that's how he announces dramatic foreign policy announcements, dramatic moves that he plans to make. Nothing at all, Tanya. So I think that's a good indication that they are very carefully calculating what happens next.
Absolutely. It is anytime the president is not tweeting, it's significant. Are Democrats likely to be consulted on the response here? I mean, we know that they were very upset about not being told or consulted about the attack on Soleimani before it happened. Is there a chance that they will demand to have a say in how this attack is responded to?
Well, you know, lucky for them, they have an opportunity to voice those concerns because tomorrow the White House is set to brief the full House and Senate on the Soleimani strike. And you can bet that those lawmakers will be bringing up what happens next as well. We know that House Speaker Nancy Pelosi was already planning to take a vote on a resolution to limit the president's military actions against Iran out of fear of what doing something would mean with regard to a potential war. And so the administration has tried to tamp down those fears, the president saying many times this week alone that the world is now a safer place, that Americans are safer. But that comes at a cost, as we are seeing now. And it's too early to say how high that cost is and whether there will be other strikes against the U.S. as well. And so these are concerns that Democrats will be bringing to the White House, and we'll just have to see what the president decides.
Right. And Catherine, what other types of responses could be possible here other than a conventional military retaliation?
A concept that people talk a lot about in military circles, which is called the gray zone. And this is the battle space between peace and conventional warfare. And that's when you have in your arsenal things like cyber attacks where attribution is so difficult. So we think about a response from the United States in terms of what happened this evening with Iran in a very conventional way, but I would encourage people to think about it in a slightly more imaginative way, because in these scenarios, my contacts always say that stealth is your friend and that not being able to make a firm attribution to a response also is your friend. So whether it comes through the United States or whether it comes through one of our allies in the regions, and as you know, for covering this area for a number of years, the U.S. and its allies have used cyber techniques to really go at the heart of Iran's nuclear program in the past. I mean, that's not a new idea. So what the idea I would leave folks at home with today is to start thinking about the concept of the gray zone. Again, it's that battle space between peace and conventional warfare, and unfortunately, it's a battle space where nation states are sort of on a level playing field with bad actors because of issues of attribution, the use of cyber, and the like. But, you know, stealth is your friend in a situation like this, and I don't want to read too much into the lack of information that we've had from the White House about the casualties and the scope of the damage. But again, stealth and a little bit of mystery is a friend in this situation.
Sure, we all remember Stuxnet and you know, that cyber attack, which resulted actually in physical explosions in within
if I could, that raises though a whole sort of host of sort of larger ethical issues, like when does a cyber attack really cross the line to become an act of war? And part of that discussion has been, does a cyber attack just wipe systems of data, or in the case of Iran's nuclear program, when it causes physical damage to the structure of an operation, does that, or like Sony here in the United States, is that actually an act of war? So cyber is appealing in many ways, but it also raises a whole host of ethical questions as to where you cross the line into an unconventional attack to an act of war.
Absolutely. All right, Catherine Herridge, thank you so much. Let's bring in now CBS News national security correspondent David Martin. An off-camera briefing with the Pentagon spokesperson just wrapped up. David, what did you learn?
Well, I have to tell you that the the backgrounder from this defense official was very uninformative. It didn't really tell us any more about what happened tonight than we already knew. It certainly did not tell us that what the damage done by these missiles was, if any. That is something we are not likely to find out about until tomorrow morning. We did get some more information on what Defense Secretary Esper was doing this afternoon and this evening. Both he and General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, were here in the Pentagon when the attack occurred, and then went to the White House to brief the president, and then came back, and they have had a number of meetings. That the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff met with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, and other officials in this building. Made calls to all of the regional allies, those would be the Arab countries in the region, and to all the traditional NATO allies of the U.S. to give them a briefing on what happened. And then, of course, there's the question that everybody wants an answer to: what will be the American response to this attack? And the answer to that was, I'm not going to forecast any response. So other than the whereabouts and the actions of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, this backgrounder from a defense official did not really add anything to what we knew.
All right, David Martin at the Pentagon, thank you so much for that update.
Sure thing.
Let's bring back in Natalie Brand on Capitol Hill. Natalie, you're getting some more information on lawmaker reaction?
Tanya, reaction is beginning to trickle in across the lawmakers still on the Capitol and speaking before cameras tonight. So let me read you some of what the House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Eliot Engel, Democrat of New York, said. He, of course, the first concern is with U.S. troops and prayers that there were no casualties. This is a very fluid situation. We don't know what lawmakers know at this point. But really, he said that we need to know more about a strategy, and there's a lot of concern that this could spiral out of control very, very quickly. This is something that Democratic lawmakers on the Hill have been calling for in the days since the U.S. strike targeting Iranian General Soleimani. What is the strategy moving forward to try to de-escalate this situation? And around the time, or I guess in the hours before we heard about this attack, keep in mind that congressional leaders were being briefed, the so-called Gang of Eight. Congressional leaders and also the leaders of the intelligence committees were receiving a briefing about the intelligence leading up to a strike. And then a couple of hours later, we heard about this new attack. So obviously there's still a lot of questions. We've also heard from some Republican lawmakers who are echoing some of the statements that have come from top administration officials, that the U.S. is not seeking war with Iran, but what happens next really is up to them. Senator Kennedy, Republican from Louisiana, said, we don't want war. All we want, it's very simple what we want, stop trying to kill us. So at this point, obviously, a very fluid situation. And as lawmakers learn more, they will likely say more. But the big question here on the Hill is, what is the strategy going forward? How do you de-escalate this situation? That's something that lawmakers will be talking about in the coming hours and days.
Natalie Brand, Catherine Herridge, and Weijia Jiang, thanks to all of you. We're going to take a quick break now. We'll be right back with much more CBSN. Thanks. Stay with us.